of eclipsing pioneer generation of the freedom struggle. Let me open my address by first drawing your attention to one statement by the revolutionary Frantz Fanon on the issue and the topic that we are addressing now. I think there's a PowerPoint being shown.
Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. We must rid ourselves of the habit of minimizing the actions of our fathers or feigning incomprehension when considering their silence and passivity. They fought as well as they could, with the arms that they possessed then, and if the echoes of their struggle have not resounded in the international arena, we must realize that the reasons for this silence lie less in their lack of heroism than in their fundamentally different international situation of our times. It needs more than one native to say, "We've had enough," before we could hold today on our own, certain of our victory.
Yes, it needs, it takes, it has taken, it will always take more than one native to say we have had enough and contribute to a society to move forward towards freedom. In my address, I should have said, given recognition of the people we have called former freedom fighters. I don't know whether they accept that. Does being a freedom fighter stop? I think that a freedom fighter is a freedom fighter forever. So even as long as they are around, as long as they've left the record, they are participating in the freedom struggle. Mbikusita Lewanika was the founder President General of the Northern African Congress in 1948, and he served up to 1951. Earlier than that, at the age of 24, he was the founder secretary of the first urban welfare society in Livingstone. And yet, is hardly mentioned in the Zambian history books, in the Zambian politics. He does not even have one pit latrine named after him. He does not even have one pit latrine named after him. And history will enlighten us as to why. When we talk of politics and pitfalls, maybe I should define my idea. Politics is about power. And the politics of ignoring founding fathers, pioneers, other contributors to the freedom struggle is part of a power game for those who seek to monopolize power and exclude others from even credit for the power they enjoy. The title of the conference is Forgetting. I don't believe there is any forgetting, because I don't believe you can forget something purposely. I don't think you can forget something deliberately. The eclipsing of the founding generation of freedom fighters is not a matter of forgetting. It's a deliberate power game for purposes of monopolizing power. The pitfall of that is the other thing we have to look at. What has it cost us that this has taken place? What have we lost in terms of ideas, in terms of approaches, and so on. I hope in the course of this opening remarks of mine, I'll hint towards what we have lost. Perhaps also, I should say that the reason I say it's deliberate is because the people who create this invisible man of Mbikusita Lewanika in their books are not among the totally ignorant people who don't know about him. So they leave him out deliberately. In my paper, I quote a few papers to that effect. And the hint also comes from one of the books by a Canadian professor who wrote a book called The Elites of Barosiland. And he's concluded that Mbikusita Lewanika is the Bete Noire, the black sheep of UNIP. So part of the explanation is that he was regarded as such. But there are other writers, such as the one who wrote a book called Zambia, Richard Hall, who found that everywhere he looked in the history records of Zambia, this name kept popping up. And he concluded that he was ubiquitous. So the challenge is that, was he a black sheep or was he ubiquitous? And in terms of this invisible man treatment, I would like us to refer to a quote from a book by Ralph Ellison called The Invisible Man.
I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids. I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. It is sometimes advantageous to be unseen, although it is most often wearing on the nerve. Then too, those of poor vision are constantly bumping against you, or again, you often doubt if you really exist. It is when you feel like that, you begin to bump people back. You ache with the need to convince yourself that you do not exist in the real world, that you are part of all the sounds and anguish, and you strike out.
So I take it that this conference, which is commendable, very necessary, and the nature of which should continue, is part of fighting back on behalf of those who have been unfairly and to the injury to Zambia declared invisible. We should fight on their behalf to stop being invisible. The generations of the freedom struggle can be divided in many different ways. I choose to divide them at least in three. In looking for freedom fighters, we should not forget the African indigenous kingdoms that were the first respondents to the onslaught from Europe. They should also have their contribution recognized. They heard rumors of the Berlin Conference. They got news of what had happened in the Cape area against Pondos, Tambos, the wars, the Zulu wars, right across the Zambezi, the guns that destroyed the Matabele Kingdom were nearby. So they had to find ways to respond, and they did find ways to respond. So they should be among those people you have. The next generation are those who tested Western education for the first time, the first to test Western education, Among these is Mbikusita Lewanika. Among these is Dr. Dankwa in Ghana. Among these is Jomo Kenyatta. Among these is Dube, the founder president of the African National Congress in South Africa. They used their exposure to Western education, first and foremost, to support and assist the indigenous African kingdom in their resistance. Secondly, as they got jobs in mission stations, in European enterprises, they used their education to set up welfare association to improve the condition of service of Africans, the human development aspects of Africans. And the first of these welfare association in Northern Rhodesia was in Mwenzo. We've already heard mention of Donald Swale. He chaired that. And it should also be mentioned that President Kaunda's father was among those who founded that West in 1924. The first urban one in Livingstone is the one in which Mbikusita Lewanika became a founder secretary in 1929, although there are contradictory. In his own correspondence, he mentioned that it started in 1928, but most official statements say it started in 29. I suspect it's because it started informally, and it took time for the authorities to recognize it and to start consulting it, maybe in 29. Then, in 1933, the same Livingstone Society Association made an attempt to actually start a Congress movement in Kafue in 1933. They were blocked. There were others later on who tried again in 1937. It did not go very far, but I'm told there's a paper on that, so we know about that. So that the formation of the Northern Rhodesia African Congress in 1948 was another attempt. And there was a conscious effort to ensure that this effort itself should not fail. So it was a delicate matter how to have it recognized. So a leadership which was tactful enough to manage that honor, embarked on that task successfully in 1948. To form the first, I normally call it the first overtly political organization, because it was a movement of the whole African nation. It was not a political party. It was a national movement. Parties, in a sense that we know it as sections of the same society, were to come later, maybe after 1958. So that that generation, as Fanon says, each generation has a mission to take up or to betray. What was that generation's mission? I've said what they did, but their real direct mission was to ensure that in Barosland and Northern Rhodesia, they hold off the pressures of creating a European settler colony like in Southern Rhodesia. That was their first challenge. That was their mission, to stop Northern Rhodesia and Barosland becoming a European settler colony. In the 1920s and 30s, the few European settlers in Northern Rhodesia, together with the settlers of a larger number in Southern Rhodesia, began advocating for amalgamation of the two so-called Rhodesias. That became the second mission of this generation, to fight against those proposals to amalgamate Northern Rhodesia with Southern Rhodesia. In the 1940s, after consulting with the British authorities, the white settlers shifted gears and switched to demanding federation, which they thought was more acceptable to the British government. So the second mission of this first generation was to stop the imposition of the federation. And I think that they did fulfill their mission. They did not betray it. Maybe I should pause for another.
From Mbikusita, Lewanika, fighting does not mean using abusive language, making fiery speeches, and passing on strong-worded and threatening resolutions, which means nothing and cannot be carried out.
This is a hint to where he was misunderstood. He thought that fighting did not mean abusive language. And he believed that you could fight the interests of Africans. He also believed that we had to fight for the interests of all of the Northern Rhodesians, rather than in sections. Next.
Another Mbikusita Lewanika quote: "No alienation of native lands to individuals or private companies. While native reserves, native trust lands are held firmly for Africans, the Africans cannot be neglected and exploited by industrialists, farmers, as they might otherwise be. From the trend of events in this country, it is noticeable that there will be great pressure brought in the next few years on the government to make native lands available. I believe it would be unwise for Congress to stand firm for such a total prohibition of, but I think that we must insist that on the control of the land remaining in the hands of the trustee that has African interests at heart. Alienating of native lands to Europeans should, I consider, be restricted very strongly. Good African land in the reserves and trust lands can be developed by cooperatives and African marketing to the benefit of the African population. The capital required is in the government's hands, accumulated for many years from income tax payments, which see profits made out of cheap African labor. The basic principle is for us to say, help us to develop our lands, and do not take them away from us to exploit for private profit."
The purpose of this, I'm bringing it up because the narrative that has been popularized is that he was conservative. You notice there's nothing conservative about that. You could lecture about that. Even the present government is more conservative than that. On the issue of land, he was very strong. And this he said in 1951 in his last speech as President of Congress. There are other quotations I'd like you to hear from him from that period, so that as you review his contribution, in terms of ideas, in terms of the objective, rather than the temperament, how non-conservative he was.
The economy of Northern Rhodesia is at present based on the production of copper, which is much in demand today due to the unsettled conditions of the world. As soon as the world conditions are settled, which they are bound to be in the course of time, copper will not be needed as much, and the economy of the country is bound to be crippled. It is therefore essential that some basic industry which supply to everyday needs of the people should be developed on full scale, and that the majority of the population should be involved in those industries. These basic industries cannot be anything but agriculture.
More than 70 years after that statement was made in 1951, 60 years after independence, that remains relevant. It remains relevant as some of the ideas that we should not lose because we want to turn their contributors into invisible persons. Next.
Of Mbikusita's leadership characteristics, it can be said of him that he had great resilience, sharp focus on the essential, supreme self-confidence that did not require feeding on unpopular support and majority approval. Mbikusita Lewanika's leadership style was team leadership, search for common ground, and patience in seeking consensus, foresighted principle realism above narrow opportunistic emotions, disinclination to look up to populism and its short-term rewards in politics.
The characteristics of team work. The African Congress, the Northern East African Congress, had two founding slogans. One was a carryover from the African National Congress of South Africa. One man, one man, or you only know one Zambia, one leader. So the slogan that you know is a contradiction of the original slogan of teamwork. So some of the things we have lost by neglecting the ideas from the founding generation was one of collective leadership rather than what we have developed, personalized leadership, a ruling party thinking it owns government, that the government of Zambia is a UPND government, that the government of Zambia is a PF government, is an MMD government, is a unique government, everything except being a national government. That is what we have lost. That's what we have to recapture from learning from history. Next and last.
Pitfalls of these leadership characteristics. There's an underlying attitude threading through all these characteristics. This, on the one hand, a consistent courage that places foresighted, principled realism above narrow, opportunistic emotions, and disinclination to look up to populism and its short-term rewards in politics. Conversely, it is an undying commitment to his father's generation. These characteristics make Mbikusita Lewanika a bete noire in the propaganda narrative of history, which explains why he has been subjected to many impediments and alignment of his life's public service without surrendering any aspect of his mission. This is a mission for Barotseland's interest being respected with a voluntary, integrated, independent Zambia, but on the basis of the Barotseland Agreement 1964, which he calmly, diplomatically, but unsuccessfully worked to have the Zambians reinstate and respect.
If I had time, I would have said his life story in terms of his contribution. Apart from the Livingstone welfare, he was president of the Kitwe African Society from 1944. It's the Kitwe African Society that proposed the amalgamation of welfare societies in 46, where his colleague Daud Yamba was elected as president. It was the Kitwe Society again in 1948. After Europeans had formed their political party in 46, the Labour Party, and two Africans had been given seats in the Legislative Assembly, it was proposed for the Federation of Welfare Association to be transformed into an overtly political party, which became the Congress. I should have also said that in 1968, he became the Lutunga of Barotseland, which did not please the powers that be. Probably the referendum of 69, probably the abrogation of the Barotseland Agreement which tore up the only legal, consultatively drawn, agreed arrangement that makes Barotseland an integral part of Zambia. It was torn up by people who wanted to forget history and betray their commitments as part of the expression of their displeasure with him. He spent his liturgy marshalling all his softness, his patience, his friendliness, his diplomacy, pleading with the Zambian government not to tear up Zambia by tearing up the Barotseland Agreement. He died having failed. With that failure, on top of having abolished the multi-party system, sometimes, which I think is a mockery, although I'm surprised many Zambians don't think so. They think Harry Nkumbula, one of Harry Nkumbula's contribution to national unity was the Choma Declaration. How can you build national unity based on surrendering our freedom of association? And in any case, by the time of the Choma Declaration, they had already changed the constitution. They had already laws making it illegal to have another political party. So they betrayed the multi-partyism. And this is why I'm saying, with this experience of betraying the foundational principles of the generation that started the struggle for independence, we reach a point where I pause and reflect upon a poem by Black American poet Langston Hughes about what happens to a dream deferred. Because the promises of independence have been deferred. What happens to those dreams of independence that have been deferred?
What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over, like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?
A dream deferred. Does this just sag like a heavy load? People just complaining and being